In the unforgiving arena of the UFC's octagon, warriors are tested and mixed martial arts legends are born. Through those trials, a select few rise above the rest. These aren't just fighters, they're modern-day gladiators, the true masters of combat. From submission artists to striking specialists, each of them have etched their names in history with their journeys paved in blood and sweat. Join us as we pay homage to the greatest of the greats. From the pioneers who opened doors to today's champions, they're all here. As we dive into this countdown, let the debates begin. Get ready to dissect and deliberate as we give you MMA Junkie's 30 greatest UFC fighters of all time.
Dustin Poirier's pinned message on social media for the past 7 years has read, "It's all about perseverance." And it's hard to find a more fitting quote to describe the UFC career of the Diamond. The world has seen Poirier hit the lowest of lows during his UFC tenure, which dates back to a January 2011 Octagon debut. He shed blood, sweat, and tears in a losing manner. That's only been a table setter for the historic heights he's accomplished. From fight of the year worthy battles with the likes of Justin Gaethje, Max Holloway, Dan Hooker, Michael Chandler, and more, to double-digit bonuses, a violent reel of knockouts, and being the only man to defeat Conor McGregor twice in MMA competition, Poirier has put together a resume on the sport's biggest stage that other fighters could only dream of. Poirier has maintained status as a top 5 fighter through the majority of his UFC run. First at featherweight, then at lightweight. He's achieved the financial security for his family that he's craved since he was first introduced to the world as an amateur on the Fightville documentary. And everything he's done beyond that, and moving forward, is purely for his passion of the fight game. The only milestone that has truly evaded Poirier during his storied Octagon run is an undisputed UFC championship. He's won the interim title, fought for the BMF belt, and established himself as a household, can't-miss name for fight fans. If that doesn't make him worthy of being one of the top 30 greatest fighters in UFC history, I'm not sure what else would.
Frank Shamrock was and is still referred to as the other Shamrock. Born Frank Suarez, Shamrock was the younger adopted brother of Ken Shamrock. His brief but impactful success is what leads to his number 29 ranking on our list of the 30 greatest fighters in UFC history. Frank Shamrock's time in the UFC was short, 5 fights, but he made the best of them. In his first fight, which was for the UFC's inaugural, now known as the light heavyweight title, but at the time, the middleweight title, Shamrock beat a former tournament winner and wrestling phenom in Kevin Jackson. All it took was 16 seconds for him to go from his UFC debut to UFC champion. He would return 4 months later to defend his title versus Igor Zinoviev, and that fight lasted 6 seconds longer than the first. We would get a true test in his next title defense versus Jeremy Horn. Now that fight went 16 minutes and some change, but Shamrock would tap Horn to a knee bar and rack up his second title defense. A few months later, next up was John Lover. Lover was stopped via TKO as he submitted to punches, and now Shamrock, in less than 1 year, had won a UFC title and defended it 3 times. Shamrock had even spent 25 minutes in the octagon, which is a full-distance title fight as we know it today. But if there was ever a meat and potatoes to Frank Shamrock's career, it would be in his next and final appearance in the UFC. His opponent that night, Tito Ortiz. The fight was uneventful in that Ortiz took down and held down Shamrock for a majority of the first 3 rounds. But in the process, Ortiz tired, and Shamrock knew it. He knew it would be a weapon for him even before the fight started, so he was in survival mode for most of the fight, knowing the tide would eventually turn. And it did with 10 seconds to go in round 4 as Shamrock, after a guillotine attempt, which he then reversed to a top position, he then rained down some hammer fists, and Ortiz tapped. This was the David and Goliath fight that would secure Shamrock's legacy and put a spotlight on strength and conditioning going forward.
Francis Ngannou lands at number 28 on this list, but I think we can all agree he's probably number 1 when it comes to instilling fear in his opponent's souls. The 6'4" heavyweight amassed a record of 12-2 in the UFC, 17-3 overall. Ngannou would make his UFC debut in 2015, beating Luis Enrique by TKO at UFC on Fox 17. His next 3 fights would see him get wins over Curtis Blades, Bojan Mihajlovic, and Anthony Hamilton, all by stoppage. Next up would be the first time he faced a former UFC heavyweight champion, in Andre the Pitbull Arlovski. Ngannou would dispatch of the Pitbull in the first round, claiming his first of 4 victories over former UFC heavyweight champions. The win over Arlovski set up his toughest opponent to date, a former K1 World Grand Prix Max champion in Alistair Overeem. If we're making a list of the most brutal KOs in UFC history, this one would have to be at the top, with Ngannou nearly turning Overeem into a Pez dispenser with that gigantic uppercut. In my opinion, this was the fight that put Ngannou on the map. The victory over Overeem set the stage for Ngannou's first title shot against a fighter who many believe is the greatest heavyweight that ever lived in Stipe Miocic. This would be the first time we ever saw weakness in Ngannou's game, as Miocic used wrestling and cardio to retain his belt, defeating Ngannou by unanimous decision. Looking to bounce back, Ngannou gets booked against fellow knockout artist Derek Lewis. This promised to be fireworks except one thing, not a good fight for either guy. Lewis walks away with the W, but there was really no winner that night. The defeat stung, but would prove to be the last time we see Ngannou lose in the UFC. From there he took out top contender Curtis Blades, again finishing him by TKO. Francis Ngannou would then face back-to-back former heavyweight champions in Cain Velasquez and Junior Dos Santos. The Predator would rack 2 wins, both by stoppages. Up-and-comer Jairzinho Rozenstruik would be next. A crazy exchange would lead to Rozenstruik's demise as Ngannou finished him by KO in round 1. The victory would ensure a rematch with champion Stipe Miocic. The rematch would go a little different this time for Ngannou as he blended his striking, his wrestling, and this time around he got the finish, evening up the series at 1-1. This sets the stage for the final fight in the UFC for Francis Ngannou, a fight against interim champion Ciryl Gane. After dishing out 5 consecutive finishes, Ngannou had to go to the judges' scorecards. Despite suffering tears in his knee, Francis Ngannou would end up winning a unanimous decision, becoming the undisputed UFC heavyweight champion. Ngannou would leave the UFC to sign with PFL, leaving one of the most anticipated fights in UFC history on the table, a fight against, of course, Johnny Bones Jones. While Ngannou's reign of terror in the UFC may have been short by some heavyweight standards, his body of work and vicious KO cement him as the 28th greatest UFC fighter of all time. And sorry, John Jones, the current baddest man on the planet.
Number 27, Yuanna Yan. Please, don't let Yuanna Yan final years of her fighting career cloud the great things she's done in the sport. Yes, I know she finished on a knockout loss. Yes, I know she was 2-5 in her past 7 performances before walking away from MMA. But what came before that was damn impressive. And dare I say, great. Prior to this slump, and I'm using air quotes here because she was literally fighting the world's best, she was literally still in championship fights and very competitive championship fights. Prior to this, Yuanna Yan was on a 14-0 run that put her as one of the most dominant champions in the UFC at the time, and they must-watch attraction. She fought mean, she fought nasty, but also had an extremely advanced technique for the time, putting her light years ahead of her competition. And outside of the cage, she was also brash, she was also cool, and had this endearing style about her. There's no doubt Yuanna Yan is great. The records and stats are there to back this up. She's the most dominant champion the UFC strawweight division has ever seen, as she was able to defend the belt a total of 5 times, something no fighter in that division has come close in doing. In my opinion, she's the greatest strawweight to ever do it. She's got the highest number of title defenses and a quality resume, defeating the likes of Carla Esparza, Jessica Andrade, Claudia Gadelha, Tisha Torres, Michelle Waterson, Karolina Kowalkiewicz, and the list goes on. I feel like Yuanna Yan gets some unfair slack here, and probably a lot of that has to do because she had to play heel against a very likable Rose Namajunas. But if you just look at her run objectively, there's never been a force in that division as powerful as her, at least for now. And that's why Yuanna Yan made MMA Junkie's 30 greatest UFC fighters of all time.
Perhaps no fighter has displayed more heart than Frankie "The Answer" Edgar, a former UFC lightweight champion who competed in 3 different weight classes and notched wins in 3 different weight classes. When you think of Edgar, you think his crowning moment against BJ Penn in Abu Dhabi, or his absolute wars with Gray Maynard, specifically when he miraculously survived an early onslaught to battle Maynard to a majority draw. He ended up capping off the trilogy with a knockout, and Frankie Edgar would go on to notch humongous wins over a lot of big names, former champions, and top contenders. He would suffer some losses on the way, but he was a perennial contender throughout his career, like when he derailed the hype train of Yair Rodriguez, or when he picked up that first round knockout of Chad Mendes. Edgar's final octagon win came over Pedro Munoz, making him join a select few to secure wins in 3 different weight classes. There was no one like Frankie "The Answer" Edgar, and you knew you were getting 150% every time he competed.
Love him or hate him, Tito Ortiz knew how to play the game. And when it comes to the early days of the UFC, he's a must-mention in any conversation. The Huntington Beach bad boy leaned into the bad guy role in the early days of the modern era UFC, making it all the more frustrating for his haters that he won over and over. Long before he was a UFC Hall of Famer who defended his title 5 times successfully, Ortiz burst into the national spotlight in 1997 at UFC 13. That was during the tournament days of the promotion, and he went 1-1. Tied with John Jones for 3rd most pay-per-view main events, Ortiz drew eyeballs every time he competed. His iconic rivalries with Ken Shamrock and Chuck Liddell fell right into place during the heyday of The Ultimate Fighter. He competed for UFC Gold in his 7th MMA fight. He lost to Frank Shamrock in the UFC 22 main event. After Shamrock vacated, Ortiz fought Vanderlei Silva at UFC 25 in April 2000, winning the light heavyweight championship at just 25 years old. Over the next 5 fights, Ortiz took on challengers unable to top him. They included Ken Shamrock and Evan Tanner, among others. That's until he met Randy Couture at UFC 44, and he lost the belt to the Natural. Ortiz was finished by an Iceman Fleury in his next fight at UFC 47 in 2004. 4 wins later, he fought Liddell again at UFC 66 in December 2006. Ortiz lasted 1 round longer, but ultimately the outcome was the same in the rematch. Ortiz exited the organization in 2012 after a 1-7-1 stretch before a stint in Bellator and another in politics. Despite the bumpy exit, Ortiz's domination in the UFC's early days and ability to attract hate and eyeballs makes him a key, impactful figure in the sport's history. For all of that and more, Tito Ortiz comes in at number 25 on MMA Junkie's top UFC fighters of all time. It's one thing to become the UFC heavyweight champion. It's another thing to inspire an entire nation in the process. Cain Velasquez blazed a trail and became an icon that triggered a wave of Mexicans and Mexican-American athletes into the sport of mixed martial arts. He never sought the spotlight, though he found it and performed successfully when in it. The soft-spoken son of Mexican immigrants with a large brown pride tattoo across his chest, he wore his heart on his sleeve and the tricolor wrapped around his fist. Velasquez entered MMA after a successful wrestling career at Arizona State University. Initially thought of as a pillow-handed puncher, Velasquez erased that reputation quickly. At 2-0, he was signed to the UFC and debuted at UFC 83 in April 2008, when he knocked out Brad Morris in what would be the first of 7 straight wins. Those victories led to October 23rd, 2010, the night Velasquez slayed a beast and a legend. At UFC 121, Velasquez etched his name in immortality when he battered, bloodied, and beat down Brock Lesnar. The celebration sincere as Velasquez wiped his face, seemingly unable to process a dream come true as a building of Mexican fans lost their mind. he was UFC heavyweight champion. His first reign quickly ended, as Velasquez was knocked out by Junior Dos Santos in 64 seconds on national television, the first fight ever on Fox. It was later revealed Velasquez fought with a knee injury, a recurring theme throughout his career. Velasquez proved the first JDS fight wasn't the likeliest of outcomes. He battered JDS to claim gold again at UFC 155, and 2 fights later, he finished an exhausted Dos Santos in round 5. Velasquez lost the belt to rival tough coach Fabricio Verdum at UFC 188, caught in a guillotine in round 3 after an exhausting first 2 rounds at elevation. From 2015 to 2019, Velasquez only fought twice and retired following a loss to Francis Ngannou in 2019. The final years of his career were riddled with injuries, particularly his knee. Oftentimes, the discussion centered around, what if? What if Velasquez didn't get hurt? Would things be different? Would he be the greatest to ever do it? But often overlooked, however, was just how great he was, even given his misfortune. The impact Velasquez had on a nation was immeasurable by all units. The way he finished the other dominant heavyweights of his era was a sight to behold. Culminating all that together, that's why Cain Velasquez is MMA Junkie's 24th best fighter in UFC history.
One of the more underappreciated names that may be on a list of greatest fighters in the UFC's 30 years of operation is Dominick Cruz. It may sound crazy for a man that is pretty much unanimously hailed as the greatest bantamweight of all time, and he deserves that distinction, far be it from me to argue that. His style confused people early on, back from his early reign to the WEC, as well as into the UFC. Perhaps it was going to decision or footworks or the technicalities, but people who appreciated the game, whether it was MMA or past boxing influences like Muhammad Ali, could really appreciate what Cruz was doing in there. And of course, like many greats, they're not really fully appreciated until they're gone. Cruz is still competing at the time of this video, still putting together post-prime wins, which I think are a really underrated checkbox to have for the greats, still getting wins over guys like Casey Kenny and Pedro Munoz. But it was his work not just as the WEC, but a 2-time UFC champion and a 2-time champion with 3 title defenses in between those 2 reigns that took place years apart, with a comeback that is almost unheard of in sports with all the adversity and injuries this man has had to overcome. One of the brightest minds in our game, Dominick Cruz deserves a spot on this list.
Number 22, Valentina Shevchenko. This fighter is easily Mount Rushmore in women's MMA. She's simply one of the very best to ever do it, and there's not much debate around that, really. Shevchenko spent the majority of her MMA career in the UFC, fighting the world's best in 2 different weight classes. Through that process, she came close twice in defeating the GOAT Amanda Nunes, while also racking up wins over respected talents such as Holly Holm, Yadina Jacek, Jessica Andrade, Juliana Peña, Sarah Kaufman, Liz Carmouche, and many others. But aside from the names, what's more important is where these victories led her to. Shevchenko holds a prestigious record of having the most title defenses in a single weight class by a woman in the UFC, which stands at 7. She's the most dominant female champion the UFC has ever seen in a single weight class, period. She stands as the greatest female flyweight in UFC history, and to be honest, it's gonna be a good while until somebody challenges that status. Shevchenko is as technical and as well-rounded as they come. Her greatness comes from professionalism, unmatched discipline, and elite-level technique. You're left with a feeling of absolute certainty that she's left no stone unturned in this process. And that relentless pursuit of perfection has turned Valentina Shevchenko into a UFC great, whether you like it or not.
Strength, power, and BJJ, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. That's right, we were slowly seeing the sport evolve as one sport specialists were not having the success that their predecessors once enjoyed. The new breed of fighters were not just shoring up their deficiencies, they were creating advantages by being well-rounded. That was Matt Hughes, number number 21 on our list of the 30 greatest fighters in UFC history. I don't know if it was the country breakfast or his work on the farm, but this guy was as strong as an ox. If Hughes got his hands on you, you were toast. If he didn't drive you through the canvas, you certainly were going down. And then it was pick your poison, as this wrestler could pummel you or submit you. The man was an absolute tank, and this tank wanted to rumble. From 1998 to 2006, Hughes competed 45 times. After a couple of cameos early on, Hughes went 2-1 in the UFC, as he was finding his footing, traveling all over the world and competing in different promotions. It was at UFC 34 when Hughes finally settled in with the MMA leader, and that would be his home for the rest of his career. That night, Hughes would slam Carlos Newton to win the UFC welterweight title. In early 2004, Hughes would get caught slipping, as they say. He was choked out by BJ Penn, one of the fighters who was trying to establish the lightweight division at the time. This was a huge upset, as a lighter weight fighter used technique to beat the nearly invincible bull that was Hughes. Later that year, Penn would leave the UFC and the title was vacant, with Hughes in line to seize a second title reign. His opposition would be a young George St. Pierre. Hughes would submit GSP and then defend the title 2 more times, including a second encounter with both Frank Trigg and BJ Penn. Notably, that second Trigg fight would eventually end up in the UFC Hall of Fame's fight wing years later. Now this is important. Sandwiched in between the second Trigg and Penn fights, Hughes would defeat both Joe Riggs and Royce Gracie. However, they wouldn't go down as title defenses. Riggs didn't make weight, and Gracie only accepted his fight at a catchweight at 175 pounds. It's fair to say Hughes should have had 9 title defenses instead of 7. In 2006, Hughes would face GSP again, only this time Rush would defeat Hughes via head kick and punches and launch his own meteoric career. Hughes closed out his career going 4-for-4, including losing his trilogy fight versus BJ Penn, though both fighters were slowly exiting their athletic peaks and slowing down. Hughes entered the UFC's Hall of Fame in 2010 in the Pioneer Wing for his accomplishments.
In at number 20 on our 30th anniversary list is the first UFC Women's Champion of all time, Ronda Rousey. Doing things for the first time wasn't exactly new for Ronda. She became the first American woman to medal in judo at the Olympics, taking home a bronze at the 2008 Olympic Games. But when she became an MMA fighter, that's when she truly shook up an entire industry. She convinced UFC President Dana White to go from women will never fight in the UFC to being all in on Ronda Rousey. So much so that he handed her the first UFC Women's Championship at a press conference. Ronda never fought for that very first title. So her first fight in the UFC was actually her first title defense, and that was at UFC 157 in 2013 against Liz Carmouche. Ronda won that fight by first round armbar, and in fact that was her 7th fight in a row she won by first round armbar. It was her signature, of course. But throughout this entire time, what Ronda was doing as she finished every opponent through her 6-fight title reign, she was an absolute rock star outside of the cage. She was a crossover star, bringing so many eyes to the sport, helping grow the entire sport as a whole, and paving the way for the next generation of women that followed behind her. After back-to-back losses to Holly Holm and Amanda Nunes, she used that crossover appeal to become a WWE superstar, which is what she's doing today. Her MMA career only lasted 5 years and 9 months, but her impact in the sport changed the landscape of fighting forever, especially in the UFC that went from 0 women's divisions to 4 today. While she was on top, she was untouchable, just worlds apart from her competition, and that's why she lands at number 20 on our 30th anniversary list.
For more than a decade, the world has been blessed with the chance to see Max Holloway grow into an all-time great inside the octagon. After making his UFC debut in 2012 as a wide-eyed 20-year-old, Holloway spent his initial years with the promotion trying to find his identity as a fighter. Eventually, he found his footing, and in the best way possible. A 10-fight winning streak led him to interim UFC gold, then back-to-back finishes of the great Jose Aldo spelled a new era of 145-pound greatness. Holloway's reign would go on to consist of some of the most statistically memorable title fight performances we've ever seen, particularly his record-setting beatdown of Brian Ortega at UFC 231 in Toronto. Alexander Volkanovski would eventually prove to be the nemesis Holloway couldn't overcome to extend his time on top, as he lost 3 times to the Great. Even without the belt, though, Holloway continues to be an obstacle most 145-pounders simply can't deal with. Ultimately, Holloway's body of work, from an all-time winning streak to multiple title defenses and more significant strikes landed in UFC competition than any fighter in company history, makes him a shoo-in as one of MMA Junkie's top 30 fighters in all of UFC history.
All right, stop, collaborate, and listen. Number 18 is about to glisten. Yeah, if you haven't figured it out yet, coming in at number 18, the Iceman Chuck Liddell. If the UFC had a logo like the NBA, it would probably be Chuck Liddell. He was exactly what the UFC needed at the time, and he had the look, he had everything you would expect from a cage fighter, and the skills to back it up. Chuck came into the UFC and had instant success with his first fight. His second fight would be a loss to Jeremy Horn, but it's one that he would eventually avenge. That loss lit a fire under the Iceman. He would go on to win his next 8 fights in the UFC. He was an unstoppable force, and the UFC knew it. They built around him. Dana White had so much confidence in Chuck Liddell that he was one of the few fighters who were allowed to represent the UFC in Pride Fighting Championships. He went 2-1, getting victories over Guy Mezger, Alistair Overeem, and he would eventually lose to Quinton Rampage Jackson. There was a time when the UFC and Pride had a big rivalry. The UFC had Chuck Liddell, and Pride had Wanderlei Silva. For years we would debate who was actually king, and thanks to the acquisition of Pride by the UFC, we finally got to see it. The Iceman came home with a unanimous decision that night, ending all speculation. Liddell was responsible for not just bringing new eyes to the sport, but keeping them there. His run in the UFC was epic, and he was one of the first stars to transcend into the mainstream media. TMZ, TV shows, movies, you name it, the Iceman did it. He not only put the UFC on the map, he made the light heavyweight division pop. In the 80s, boxing had the 4 kings: Roberto Duran, Thomas Hearns, Marvin Hagler, and Sugar Ray Leonard. In the UFC, Chuck Liddell helped pioneer a similar era. Along Vitor Belfort, Randy Couture, and Tito Ortiz, these 4 beat the crap out of each other, with Chuck Liddell holding 2 wins over Couture, 2 wins over Ortiz, and 1 over Vitor Belfort. Chuck's impact was like no other. He was the face for the UFC, and you could even argue that he might have been the face for MMA in that time period. To this day, if you mention his name, people who have never seen a fight in their lives know exactly who you are talking about. So keep chilling, Chuck, and congrats on coming in at number 18 on our list.
Henry Cejudo has a whole lot of gold, and in case you forgot, he'll be sure to remind you. An Olympic gold medalist wrestler and a former UFC flyweight and bantamweight champion. Cejudo became one of the few dual champs and became one of the few dual champs to defend both titles. Henry Cejudo also dethroned the great Demetrius Johnson. Demetrius Johnson, who was the record holder for most title defenses in UFC history. The man to snap that winning streak was Henry Cejudo. Now, Cejudo had lost to Demetrius Johnson the first time and failed just like plenty of other flyweights did in dethroning DJ. But he ended up getting his rematch at UFC 227 and defeated Demetrius Johnson by split decision. But the incredible thing about Henry Cejudo is he came into the sport as a credentialed wrestler and ended up rounding out his game by also adding a dangerous striking game. We saw that first when he defeated Wilson Hayes, and he went on a winning streak by winning 6 fights in a row, which included dethroning Demetrius Johnson, defending his flyweight title against TJ Dillashaw, who was attempting to become dual champ, and then winning the vacant title from Marlon Moraes, the vacant bantamweight title, and defending it against Dominick Cruz. After all those accomplishments and adding great names like Dominick Cruz, TJ Dillashaw, and Demetrius Johnson to his resume, Henry Cejudo walked away. He retired, but he came back 3 years later. He challenged bantamweight champion Aljamain Sterling. He fell short by split decision, but Henry Cejudo is not done yet. He's eager to get his gold back, and expect Henry Cejudo to be fired up in his pursuit to climb back to the championship.
Number 16, Israel Adesanya. Stylebender may be taking a break from fighting, but he's still not done with MMA and has a good chance to further his legacy upon his return and improve his standing on MMA Junkie's 30 greatest fighters of all time. Yet, despite still having some time left on the clock, Adesanya is already in a very highly coveted spot on this list. Adesanya came into the UFC with plenty of hype, as he had a good reputation in the kickboxing world, and well, he lived up to every bit of it. Entering the UFC with a record of 11-0, Adesanya defeated PFL champion Rob Wilkinson in his debut and went on to rack up victories over Marvin Vettori, Brad Tavares, Derek Brunson, and Anderson Silva before getting his first opportunity at UFC Gold. At UFC 243 in 2019, Adesanya put one of the greatest championship fights ever seen, along with a gutsy Kelvin Gastelum. That interim title win kickstarted a run that came close to matching the great Anderson Silva's. Adesanya defeated Robert Whittaker to unify the belt in his next fight, and then went on to defend the title against Joel Romero, Paulo Costa, Marvin Vettori, and Robert Whittaker again, and then Jared Cannonier, cementing himself as one of the most dominant champions of the time. After this impressive run, Adesanya lost the belt to arch nemesis Alex Pereira, but then recovered it the following year just to lose it again, this time to Sean Strickland. Yes, Adesanya has had some hiccups of late, but that doesn't take away the extraordinary work that he did years prior. There's no doubt he's among the very best to ever do it, and that's why he sits at number 16 on MMA Junkie's 30 greatest UFC fighters of all time.